everyone, welcome back to Beginner Quilting 101, and today is lesson 3. Today is the day we're going to learn all about prepping and cutting our fabric. It's very important because if we want everything to fit, we want to make sure we're cutting correctly, we're going to make sure we're going to square up our fabric, and we do need to talk a little bit about prepping that fabric. So stick around, let's get started. All right, so now you have purchased your fabric that we talked about last lesson, and now we need to get ready to prep our fabric and prep ourselves for sewing this quilt. So the first thing that we need to talk about is really an age-old argument, and I want to address both sides of it, and that is whether or not you should pre-wash your fabric. Now you have purchased fabric, I'm assuming from a reputable quilt store or a reputable place, and you have beautiful 100% quilt store quality cotton, and we are ready to go. So we have some choices to make. Right now it's all nice and smooth. It came from the quilt shop. It might have a little fold wrinkle in it here and there, but pretty much you think it's ready to go off the bolt. And there are some arguments between whether we should just start cutting right now or whether we should take our time and pre-wash and pre-press our fabric. So let me address that. Firstly, don't cut your fabric without at least pressing it first. So we definitely want to get out our iron, we want to get the fabric open, and we want to lay it out and press all the wrinkles out of it, including that main fold line, as best we can. We can press with starch, you can press with steam, you can use a squirty water bottle to do that, but we definitely want to press that out so that it's nice and smooth, so that when we go to fold it back over and square it up, we don't have any weird little wrinkles and things like that in it. Now, years and years and years ago, I was taught that you should always pre-wash your cotton, and cotton, as we know, when you put it through the washer and the dryer, it shrinks. That's what happens, whether it's our clothes or our fabric or whatever. So pre-washing will pre-shrink that fabric, and it'll definitely make a couple things. It'll make the edges where the fabric was cut fray a little bit, they'll get some strings on it, it will pre-shrink. And so a lot of the argument for pre-shrinking is if you don't pre-wash and pre-shrink your fabric, you're going to have wrinkles in your finished quilt. Well, let's dispel that myth. You're definitely going to have wrinkles in your finished quilt because the way, even if it's nice and beautiful and smooth and we get our quilting stitches in it, we're actually putting batting inside the quilt. So we're going to have, even if we pre-wash all the fabrics for our top and we pre-wash the fabrics for our back, our batting is still going to shrink in the wash as well. There are ways to keep it from doing that. You can wash it in cold water, you can hang it to dry, but it's still going to have a tiny bit of shrinking, which means there is going to be some little bunchy spots in your quilt. It's part of the charm of owning a quilt, and it's okay. You know, and the more you quilt it, the less it tends to want to kind of squirrel up a little bit because it's got so many quilting stitches in it to stabilize that batting. So that's the first answer to that question. The second answer, which I think is way more important, and that is, do you pre-wash for color fastness? So many quilters will actually take their fabrics and pre-wash and pre-dry their fabrics. They put them in the washing machine with a color catcher that you can buy at the local grocery store or the local big box store, and that is, you put it in with your laundry. Some of you may already be using this to keep your jeans, the color fastness of your jeans. Sometimes when you put them in the wash, the color can come out. We all know that. If you've ever washed a white t-shirt with a red shirt and that dye bled, and that is a possibility with quilting fabric, especially with darker colors, indigo blues, reds, purples. Purple contains red. So anytime you have an opportunity for that color dye to run, you want to think about that. Now, washing and drying your fabrics before you're cutting them won't necessarily guarantee that they'll stay color fast and that they won't run. Using a color catcher is a good thing in the water. It tends to absorb all of those dyes, and it keeps things from pooling and puddling on your fabric. But it is not perfect, and it's not the only solution. The only real solution that I know of to prevent color from running is to pre-wash your fabric and pre-soak your fabric in a chemical called Retain. And this is the word out there. You can get a 32-ounce bottle on Amazon right now. We'll put a link in the description box for that in case you didn't know about Retain. I would have showed you what the bottle looks like, but I can't find my bottle of Retain at the moment. But here is a picture of what the bottle looks like, and I will link this in the description box below. Now, Retain usually is an ounce, I think, per gallon of water, if I'm not wrong on that. And so Retain is a little less than $1 an ounce to purchase it, but it does help to control and set dyes in fabric. So if you pre-soak and pre-wash your fabrics in Retain, that should pretty much cure all of the fabric running that you can experience if you're concerned with that. True confession form, I will tell you that I should pre-wash my fabrics, but often do not. Years and years ago, when I started quilting, I had little children, I had little boys, and so with 4 boys, my husband included, in the house, it was a lot of laundry. So every time I brought new fabric into the house and had to pre-wash the fabric, it got to be a lot of extra washing and extra ironing, and I just got out of the habit of pre-washing all of my fabrics. And that can be a problem because Retain doesn't really work when you put it in with the quilt after the fact. So you have to use that product before you wash and dry and cut all of your fabrics to put into your quilt. So I sometimes have issues. Now, most of my samples that I make do not get washed, and those quilts that I do make that do get washed, I actually pre-wash them and use the color catcher method as much as possible to prevent those things from running. But a lot of my samples have not been washed. In the occasion that I've had to wash the samples, I have had some reds that have run before, and it has caused a few issues with a few of my tops. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that because the choice has already been made. But if you're very, very concerned, if you have chosen a red fabric and a white fabric, I highly recommend that you pre-wash those fabrics ahead of time so that you don't have a disaster at the end when you gift your quilt and the color has run and you just get heartbroken. So if you're worried about being heartbroken, you can go ahead and do that. Now, when you're making t-shirt quilts and things like that, most t-shirts have already been washed 100 times in the wash anyway, which is why we're turning them into a quilt because we love them so much. So I would worry less about color fastness on a t-shirt quilt or something like that, unless all the quilts are white, all the t-shirts are white and the fabric you're putting with it is not. So just keep that in mind when we're about to do our fabric. And if you haven't pre-washed your fabric and you want to, well, you can just stop the video now, go pre-wash your fabric, and then we can get started on cutting in a moment. Now, the second step to prepping before we go ahead and start cutting our fabric is to read through our pattern. Now, this is another questionable thought. Most people think you could just sit down and the pattern is written step by step by step, and so therefore I can just read as I go and I'll know everything that I need to know about that design. I won't make any mistakes. That's not always how it goes. So as a designer, I can tell you that because I have a lot of skills and a lot of experience, sometimes I can just look at a pattern and go, this is easy. I'll just use the drawings or I'll use the pictures and I'll follow along and it'll be fine. I think that for those of us that learn visually, that's an easy thing to do. We'll go straight to the pictures. We won't worry about the words. For those of us that learn auditorially, we like to read the words and then look at the pictures in case we don't understand something. I would tell you that reading through the pattern fully ahead of time will prevent a multitude of mistakes and errors. It'll also prevent you from sitting down to work start to finish on a project and finding out you're missing half of what you need to do it. The way pattern designers write patterns occasionally is to give you a lot of notes. They give you notes on picking fabrics, they give you notes on whether or not to use pre-cuts, and if you are using pre-cuts, what to watch out for when you're doing that. All those things are very important, and they're the reason they're written in the pattern. So instructions can be very helpful. And for those of us that are not instruction readers and we just like to take an appliance out of the box, plug it in, see what happens, that can be really difficult. But I highly recommend that we read through the pattern. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. Very quickly, I promise it'll be painless. And there really isn't a lot of really tricky information in this pattern to start, but there can be if you don't read the pattern first. So let's take a look at what we're dealing with the pattern. So firstly, if you haven't had your opportunity to pick up Pat Sloan's book, Teach Me to Make My First Quilt, you want to go ahead and do that. And the cover quilt that we're looking at is the one that we're making today. It's the one behind me on the wall. So the first thing we're going to do is open up to the pattern that we're going to make, and that is on page 74, and it's called the 9-patch quilt. So I have zoomed in really heavy on the camera here so we can see exactly what's happening in the instructions. So the first thing that usually happens, you get a title of a quilt, you usually see a picture of some sort of finished. It also tells you what the finish size is, or it should tell you what the finish size is, and also probably the block size. These are really important because what if you want to make the quilt a little bigger or a little smaller? So reading through the pattern first before you go pick up your fabric or start to cut gives you all the information that you need to get started. And knowing what the block size is can be really handy because now we know where we need to finish. So there are a few notes here, and again, this is the area where a designer might put some very important notes for what you're going to learn, what you might need, where to watch out for, where to pick up little hints and tips. This is a very simple note that Pat's written that just tells you what you're going to learn in this particular quilt. We're going to learn to put blocks together, add sashing stones, border stones. Those are the things you're going to learn, and that's a great note to understand what we're going to be doing. Now the next section is on materials, and that just tells you all of the materials that you need to make this quilt top. And in this case, Pat even gives you batting and backing and binding, borders and binding, so that you have all the fabric you need to complete the quilt. So that's very handy. This is also where you might find optional materials. For example, different types of batting, types of stabilizer that you might need, little handy hints if you're making a bag. It'll tell you what hardware that you need and all those types of things. So this is a handy spot that we need to read ahead of time, even really when we're going to purchase materials, and before we leave the quilt store, we should just kind of glance through this and make sure we have everything we need. The next we come to the cutting instructions, and these are pretty straightforward cutting instructions. So each cutting instruction should be laid out by fabric. If the designer's worth their salt, they'll label the fabric. So you can see up here in the materials list, each fabric is a label. This is fabric A, B, C. That helps you organize your fabrics. And then in the cutting instructions, there the labels are again. So she calls this the green fabric because that's how it's pictured in the quilt. But if you're buying your own fabric and you're not getting a kit, then this green word doesn't help very much. So fabric A is what we're calling it. So she identifies fabric A as the green and fabric B as the white. And those are the two fabrics we're going to concentrate on in this video. And then there is all the cutting instructions for fabric C, fabric D, fabric E, and then the backing fabric as well if we're going to get to that point. So that's super handy to know. Moving on to the next page, we see a little bit of instruction on how we're going to make the quilt. So she talks about the type of seam allowance you're going to have. And now every quilt pattern is genuinely implied to be a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It's just how the math works. Quilt patterns go by 1/2 and 1/4 measurements and sometimes 1/8 measurements depending on the types of blocks you're using. And so it's implied that we're going to be sewing them with a 1/4 of an inch seam unless otherwise directed. So in the case where you're making a bag, or maybe you're adding an extra piece of flange inside of a border or something like that, where you may be using a different seam allowance, that seam allowance will be marked inside the pattern. So clearly here in the instructions, Pat has told us we're going to be using a 1/4 inch seam, and that's very important to know. So she tells us to use a 1/4 inch seam. She also says that we're going to press the seam allowances in the directions indicated by the pattern, which is very handy. And for detailed instructions and photos, refer to block 4, the 9-patch on page 44. So we're putting this quilt together, but if we needed to understand what the 9-patch block was, we could go to page 44, and on that place, we can see very detailed instructions on what to cut, how to assemble it, absolutely all the details. So we're going to have all 9 of our pieces laid out. We're going to add this to this. Also block specs. So here's where you get all of the detailed information about the blocks themselves and step-by-step instructions on how to create that block, which is very handy to know. So I'm going to show you all those instructions, but if you needed to refer to the book for that block, then this is a spot where all of the instructions for that particular block are. So let's go back to our quilt pattern. So here is the spot where we're going to start the layout of the quilt. It's clearly marked fabric A and fabric B. Also, if you look at the next diagram, she shows all of the pressing arrows of the directions we're going to press, and we're going to press just like she tells us to in the book. And then we have, once we're done, we can assemble the quilt top by adding sashing. We're going to then add sashing in corner squares. We're going to add all that together in the quilt. That's the next pattern, adding the borders, finishing the quilt top, and also cutting out the backing fabric as she has directed us to do it. So she's told us exactly how much fabric to buy, and then she's given us some instructions on how we're supposed to cut that up. So that's handy to know. We can look at that later. So now that we've read through our pattern, we're going to concentrate right now on cutting those first 2 fabrics, because in this process, what I'd like to do is to start cutting, show you how to square up your fabric, get the parts to cut ahead of time for the first step that we're going to do, and then we can reach back to cutting later. Now, why would I not sit down and cut the whole thing all at once? Well, I do have my reasons, but the 2 most important reasons are this. When we're starting with a project where we're in this level of detail, very slow going, step by step by step, it's really handy when we get to step 1, where we can just sort of cut and start sewing right away. So by cutting only the fabrics we need for fabric A and fabric B, which are the fabrics we need for our blocks, that gets us doing some cutting and then sewing right away. So we can kind of get our feet wet and get into the meat of the sewing of the project. The second reason I want to do that is because when I see beginners, if we start at the beginning of a class and I teach everybody how to square up their fabric and how to cut their fabric, and then they spend the rest of the time building the whole quilt and picking up the pieces and all that, when they get to the end of making the quilt and they go to start their second quilt, they've already forgotten the first step in the process, so which is the cutting of the fabric and squaring up. So in this class, what I thought we'd do is we'd start with the parts that we need right now, and we'll start making the quilt, and then the next set of steps that we need, we'll cut that again. And that gives us an opportunity to revisit the squaring of the fabric, the measuring and the cutting of the fabric, and the labeling of the fabric. It helps to reinforce those skills over and over. So hopefully when you're done with this video, well, you can go back and watch it, but hopefully you won't need to go back and watch this part. But if you do, it's there forever so that you can find it. The other reason we do it is so we don't have a bunch of random parts lying around, taking them in and out of a box, and we can keep everything nice and organized and in our box right where we need it to be. So organization is totally key. So now we're going to start working on squaring up fabric A and labeling that fabric. And that brings me to why I have these cute little sticky notes here. I have fabric B and fabric A. I've got them already marked on a little sticky note. And depending on what we're making, you might want to put other things on these little notes, like this is fabric A and it's this size, and this is fabric B and it's this size. And that depends. If we're cutting a lot of extra things, so this pattern is pretty easy and pretty simple with repetitive type things and not a lot of extra parts. But let's say we had to cut strips of this fabric, and then of the same fabric we had to cut strips that were a different size, and that same fabric we cut squares that were a different size, or 2 or 3 different sizes of squares. It's always really handy to label them. That way when you're picking them up, you know exactly what they are, and you can go step by step by step through your pattern and you won't get them mixed up. And we're going to pin everything together so that we know exactly what we're looking at, and that way we won't get confused. The other reason we do this is because when we're cutting, when we get to the end of our cutting, we're going to have extra parts. It's really important to know what's the extra parts. Is this a scrap fabric or is it just an extra square I cut? Well, you're going to have labeled the things you need for your quilt, and the things that aren't labeled are going to get set aside to either be used at another time or used in the event that we have an accident, or for starting your scrap stash. So we definitely don't want to get them confused. If you pick up your parts a week or two or a month later, which I know we all sit down and sew and have plenty of time to finish things from start to finish. Not true. No one does that. So if you come back to that project months later and you lift it out of the box, you don't have to think, remeasure every part. You'll know because they're all labeled, and that's a great habit to get into. All right, let's get started with squaring up our fabric. So something to note before I change the camera, in our green fabric, or our fabric A, it says that we're going to cut 6 strips that are 4.5 inches by 42, and 42 is actually the width of the fabric. So it says up here, yardage is based on 42 inches width of fabric. Sometimes when you read a pattern, it'll say a direct measurement like it does here, 42 inches. Sometimes it'll use the acronym WOF, which means width of fabric. And typically, not always, but typically, fabric is between 44 and 45 inches wide. So 42 is a pretty conservative measurement on the width of the fabric. So you'll notice here it says 6 strips that are 4.5 by 42 inches, and then cross cut them into squares. So we're not actually going to cut a 4.5 inch strip and then cut that strip into a 42 inch strip. We're just going to cut a width of fabric strip. So in this case, this particular pattern, I think that part is just a little bit confusing, and I just wanted to make sure that you understood that before we get started. We're cutting width of fabric strips, and then we're going to cross cut those into what we need. Let's square up our fabric. So you can see I have zoomed out pretty far. You're going to see some things that you wouldn't normally see on the cutting table, but we're going to make sure that you can see all of it and you're not missing anything. So my mat right here that we're looking at is, I believe, 24 inches tall. It's a little tiny bit bigger than that, but 24 inches tall by 36 inches wide. And I'm working just off, but if I were to pull it on, I have just a tiny bit longer than a yard of fabric here, which is going to be my fabric A. And then I'm going to sort of slide this fabric, and first I want to talk to you about getting this to the point where we can square it. Okay, so I have my big piece of fabric, and it's come off the bolt, and it looks so pretty because the quilt cut it at the quilt shop and it has this nice straight edge. But it may not be exactly straight. So the first thing I'm going to do is open the fabric up, and now I'm holding on to the selvage edge, so the other selvage is underneath me, and I'm going to take this over to the iron and press it, probably within an inch of its life. I'm going to press out that center fold and any wrinkles, and if I turn this around and show you, this probably still has the remains of some wrinkles in it that you can see, but I have taken, you can use steam, you can use starch, you can use a little water bottle, whatever, to wet the fabric down to get some of the stubborn lines and creases out of it so that it's nice and flat. And while you may still see a few of the stubborn lines, all the creases are out of this fabric. So now I'm going to relay it, refold it together so I can see where I'm off on my square. So what I'm going to do is wrong sides together. I'm going to pick up and put the 2 selvages together again. And this is what every student does. They take the corners, just like we're folding the sheet. They take the 2 corners and they lay the selvage just nice and neat right along the top and the other corner together, and we're going to go corner to corner. We're going to put these together and it's going to look great. Okay? And then I'm going to hold it up as best I can. Hopefully you can see that. Do you see that there's like a bubble in it? A little bubble. It's coming right down there off the corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my fingers in between the selvage and hold on to the fabric on both sides. And I'm going to turn it so you can see that little bubble. And then as I turn my fabric back and forth, I'm going to get rid of that little bubble. So do you see how I just got rid of that little bubble in the fabric? I don't see it anymore. And if you still see it, you can keep shifting the fabric. And what I'm doing is I'm shifting one side to the other. Let me see if I can make it happen on the other side so you can see it. And now we have a bubble on the other side. Do you see that wrinkle, that bubble that's happening? And so now I'm going to put the fabric back sort of in the direction I was going before. And if I go back, oh, there's the bubble on the other side. So right in the middle of where we're talking, probably hard to see. Now I've got it so that I don't have that little bubble in the fabric, and I'm going to lay it down on my table. All right, so now that I've laid it down, my selvage is away from me and my fold is down here. And let me see if I can turn this over and you can see where my fold line was has shifted just a little bit, and I've gotten rid of that little fold. So that's an indication that the selvages weren't really meeting at the top when this was on the bolt, okay? And then remember, I put the two pieces together, the two corners together, and now that we have it laying nice and flat without that little bubble, I want you to see what's happened over here at the end. So over here at the end, the fabrics are aligned here at the end, but as it goes up, you see how they kind of split apart and they're no longer together. Okay, so that's an indication that the fabric was sitting a little crooked on the bolt, and that can happen. So when it was cut perfectly to size, to a yard, and now we've lost a little bit here because now that we've squared up the fabric, we don't have as much here as we thought. Now, quilt shops will tend to measure a quarter to a half an inch over because they know this is going to happen when you take the fabric home. And if you go to a quilt shop where they're just being super precise, you know, sometimes they can be just a little bit stingy with the fabric, but most quilt shops know that fabric needs to be squared up and that you're going to lose a little bit on both sides. So it's very important to know that if you're doing your own measurements and you're calculating, oh, I need, you know, this many 2.5 inch squares, you always want to give yourself a little bit of extra fabric because you're going to have to square it up, and some fabrics are much worse on the bolt than this one. This one's really not that bad. All right, so now we have our edge here, and I could bring over my big ruler that I told you to get in one of the previous lessons, and I could lay it down over here on the side, and I could take my rotary cutter and I can kind of eyeball a straight line and I could cut it, but it won't be straight. So what we need to do is make sure that when we lay this ruler down to cut, that we can get a nice straight edge. And also I want to point out that I am right-handed. So right now I have my ruler over on the left-hand side of where I am, and the edge of the fabric I'm going to cut is on the left-hand side, and my rotary cutter then is in my right hand. So I'm always measuring from here. And the ruler on my right-handed ruler starts on one side at 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, okay? And actually, if my ruler is around the other way, it will start at 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So my measurement is going to come from this side. So that's how I have to measure the quilt. This is how I have to go. So everything is, my cutter is in my right hand. So if you're left-handed, you're going to do it with a left-handed ruler from the left-hand side, the right-hand side, so that the cutter's then in your left hand. So I'm sorry I can't demonstrate that because I'm not left-handed, and you don't want to see that. I don't want to cut myself doing it wrong. So the other thing that I want to talk about is, you may notice on my ruler that I have these sort of weird smudgy lines. I'm sorry about the shine, but on my ruler what I have done is I have these little, like, sort of a faded line that you can see every 3 or 4 inches or so down my ruler. Now what I have done to my rulers is I've added this medical tape, and this is sort of an anti-slip, because when rulers are laid down and we're holding them with one hand and pressing the rotary cutter with the other, they can shift back and forth, and we don't want any shifting, because if we don't hold the ruler consistent from one end to the other, our pieces are not going to be right. So what I've done is I've taken this little bit of clear medical tape. This is transport tape, And if you've not seen transport tape before, it's the same tape they use when you get blood drawn. They put that little cotton ball on, and then they put this easy to tear, very easy to tear tape along the top of it. It is clear, but it has little perforations all over it. Let's get a little closer look. So here is the tape. You can find it at any medical supply store or Walmart, any big box store. It looks like that, and it's got little tiny perforations in it that allow you to tear it in different directions. So what I've done is I've taken my roll of medical tape and I've laid it down on my ruler in such a way every 3 or 4 inches or so, so that it creates some friction on the bottom of my ruler to keep it from sliding back and forth. And yet it's still see-through, so it does not obstruct my view of any of the numbers on the ruler when we're doing this. So that's just a handy tip that I use in nearly all my classes when we're working with rulers and templates. It just keeps them from sliding. So we're going to set the big ruler aside for one moment, and just the big ruler being something that is either 6 inches wide or 8 inches wide. In this case, mine's I think 8, and it's 24 inches long. And you can see now why we need that 24 inches, because we have to get from the fold all the way to the selvage at the other end. So we're going to set that aside for a moment, and we're going to get out our 12-inch square, which is our other ruler that we talked about. And you can see I've done the same tape on the back of this one as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of find my spot up here where my fabric is just past where my fabric is frayed. That's the furthest spot that I have where they don't meet. And I'm just going to bring the ruler down to the fold line and place the edge of the ruler right along the fold line. Okay? Now I know that because this is a square ruler, if my edge down here is perfectly straight, that means that this edge right here is also perfectly straight. And then I'm going to take my other ruler and I'm going to lay it down against this ruler. So holding my hand on this one so it doesn't shift, I'm going to lay my ruler down on this ruler so I know it doesn't shift. And then I'm going to cut and square up my fabric. Now, one thing I did notice is when I set the ruler down, I have plenty of room up here where I can maneuver past and cut, and I won't waste as much fabric. So I'm just going to slide my square nice and even across the bottom, and I'm going to make sure that it's still aligned. And then I'll hold it and make sure that this ruler is still aligned, okay? And then I have another little household tip for you. Now, before we do anything else, the next little piece of advice that I have for you, if you're a new quilter or you suffer from some mobility issues, is another little household tip, and that's this guy right here. Pretty much everybody has one of these little hand weights. Mine is a 5-pounder, but if you have a 2-pound or a 3-pound weight, they usually have a little flat spot to keep them from rolling. You're going to want to use this. This is going to be handy in your sewing room. So you can pick up these. I've seen them at the dollar spot at Target, really easy, but it's just a little hand weight, and we're going to use that next. So the first thing I'm going to do with my hand weight is very carefully, I'm going to set it down on top of this ruler on its flat edge so it doesn't move. And I'm going to take this ruler and move it out of the way. And I set this here to keep everything nice and flat. I don't want this ruler moving. I don't want it to shift on the fabric or anything. I just want to move our square ruler out of the way because we don't need it anymore. And then I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to take my hand. I'm going to put some pressure on this end of the ruler so that it stays in place, and it'll use that tape. This will stay in place while I start to cut. And I'm going to move my hand weight down the ruler to the other side. And the reason I'm going to do that is we can press down really easy when I'm right above the ruler, so I don't have any problem holding weight. But a lot of people, once you start getting away from you, it's hard to maintain the ruler in the same place. So naturally we want to hold down here and cut all the way to the end, and what happens is the ruler shifts. So this weight being here will prevent that ruler from shifting until you get comfortable enough that you can cut all at one time. So now that I am ready to go, I'm going to take my rotary cutter, pull back the guard to expose the blade, and I'm going to put it down on my mat just off of the fabric, slide it onto the fabric, and go all the way to the end of the fabric. And when I get to the end, I'm going to close my blade guard back up and set my rotary cutter down. That is the most important step when using a rotary cutter, is to open the guard, cut, immediately close the guard before you set the ruler down. If I teach you nothing else, I'm going to teach you to do that so you don't cut your hand. So now we're going to check just barely to see that we've cut all the way through the fabric. We're going to apply nice even pressure. If you have a new rotary blade, it should cut right through the fabric and you shouldn't have to press really hard. If you have an old rotary blade, or you're finding that here and there are little spots where it didn't cut through, that's a sign that you have a nick on your blade and you're going to need to replace it. And that happens all the time with beginners. So I made sure that I had plenty of room down here on the mat. If you try to cut off of the mat, you're going to nick your blade. And I have plenty of room on the other end of the mat to take care of this fabric. So now that I know that our edge has been cut and everything is square, I can remove the weight off the far end and I can pick up my ruler. And then this little part of the fabric that's uneven gets to go away, and that becomes part of our garbage. And then we have a nice straight square edge to start cutting our pieces. Now, coming back to our book, our fabric A says to cut 6 strips that are 4.5 by 42, which again we talked about is width of fabric. So we're going to cut 6 strips, and then it says to cross cut into 45 squares that are 4.5 by 4.5. So we're going to cut our 6 strips that are 4.5 inches right now. So our next step is to get our big ruler out again, and we're going to lay this down right here where you see where our number 4 is. That's our 4-inch mark, and then this other little line halfway in between the 4 and the 5 is 4.5, and it's actually marked right there. So depending on what kind of ruler you have, you'll need to look at that. But basically, I have on my ruler a 4-inch mark, and then an 1/8, a 1/4, another 1/8, a 1/2, another 1/8, a 3/4, another 1/8, and a 5. Okay, so right there. So I want to be at the 4.5-inch mark, and I'm going to lay my ruler down. So again, I have ruler all the way from one side of the fabric to the other, which I do. I have rulers sticking out on both sides. And I'm going to mark my 4.5-inch line. I'm going to put my fold here right on one of the straight lines here at the bottom of the ruler. And I'm going to put the edge of my fabric on the 4.5-inch mark. And then I'm going to check all the way down that it's still on the 4.5-inch mark. It'll help immensely to line up your fold along one of these straight lines, and then just check all the way down that it's correct. So once I know that my ruler is in exactly the right spot to cut 4.5 inches, I can bring my weight back if I like and put my weight on the far end of the ruler, and then again pick up my rotary cutter, open the blade, start at the bottom of the mat, go all the way down past the fabric, cut, close the blade. Okay? There we go. I'm going to set my weight over there, and then I'm going to check and make sure everything is pulled away. Notice I didn't touch this fabric at all, and I didn't shift anything, and I'm just going to pull this guy out of the way. I don't want to move him around too much because I don't want the sides of this strip to shift. I just want to move it out of the way enough that I can lay down my ruler. And again, I'm going to lay my ruler down so that my line right here on the bottom, the horizontal line, is matching the fold, and that the side all the way down is matching on the 1/4 inch. And that's what mine is doing. So I can bring my weight back, and I can do this again. Pick up the rotary cutter, open the blade, cut all the way from one end of the fabric to the other, close the blade, set it down. And we can just check very easily to make sure that it's been pulled apart, and it has, and I'm going to do that. Okay, and then very gently, carefully, I'm going to move the strip out of the way so I can keep cutting. Okay, and you kind of have to move it because unless you have some sort of a guide, you have to move the fabric in order to be able to get to the next line. So I'm going to continue cutting. I now have 2 strips. I'm going to continue cutting on camera until I get all 6 strips cut. So you can see I'm continuing to measure along the bottom and also along the side to make sure I'm still on the 4.5 inch mark. Very carefully moving my strips, and then each time I'm checking to make sure that I'm aligned on the bottom and the side. And I'm also making sure that I open the rotary blade and then close it before setting it back down. So you can see when I set the rotary blade down, I always have the blade closed. This is just prevent you from cutting your hand. It will happen, so just get into the habit now. And then I'm going to lay out my 6 strips because I have them all done and set everything aside for our next step. Okay, now you can see that we have all 6 4.5 inch strips are cut, and I have this piece of fabric left over, and I'm not sure whether this is a scrap or not yet, so I'm just going to move this and set it aside. Now, if at any time when you're cutting you find that you can't lay your pieces down your line exactly right, it may mean that things have shifted and you need to square up the fabric. And so having this extra part here, that means we can still get to the end and have what we need to finish the quilt. So now we're going to get to our second part of the fabric A cutting, which is to cross cut into 45 squares that are 4.5 inches. So here's what we're going to do with that. I'm just going to move a couple of these lower strips here so I can get to this part. So I'm going to open my strip up, and again, I'm being very careful not to shift, because remember, these are folded together, so there's 2 pieces of fabric here, and I want to make sure that these edges stay in a nice straight line. And then I'm going to turn it so that my selvage is again over here on the left, and that my fold is over on the right by my hand, which I'm going to use with the rotary cutter. Okay, always want to put your selvage edges to the measured side and your fold to the side that you're cutting, and I'm saying that specifically in case you're left-handed. Now I'm going to use my square ruler, and the only reason I'm going to use that is because it's smaller and I can manipulate it more in the space that I have, but you can use your long ruler if you need to. And then I'm going to do that same process again. So I have to square up this edge and get rid of the selvage, because we cannot use the selvage in the quilt. So here on this side, if I just flip this over, I can see there's selvage here. It's got little holes in it. It doesn't have any color on it, but if you turn it over, you can distinctly see where the weave of the fabric is different, and I have those little holes. And then I have this spot here with the white with little holes going up. So this one's actually a little further than the selvage on the other side, which is great. So I just want to make sure that the side of that is trimmed. Now, I can't do this. If I wanted to, I would lay my ruler down on this horizontal line, and then, I would take the ruler and I would cut down towards myself to get this. No, never, ever, ever cut towards yourself. If you feel the need that you want to cut that spot off on the other side, you need a rotary mat, or you need a mat that you can turn so that you can cut it on one side and then turn it back to measure it on the other. But never, ever, ever do what I just did and start cutting back towards yourself. The ruler will slip, you'll cut yourself in the arm, you'll regret it. So just don't do that. You don't ever want to do that. That's not good blade practice, so don't do that, okay? So I'm just going to repeat the square process I did before, just so I can clean off the ends, and then we'll move on with cutting. So I'm going to move my little strips out of the way, because that'll make my ruler lay more flat. And then I'm going to come back. So on this strip, I've come past the selvage, and I've laid my horizontal line down on the strip, and everything's good. So I'm going to hang on to that ruler. I'm going to lay my big ruler, I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit, down here on the end, okay? And now I know that the ruler up against another is on the square edge, so I'm just going to gently move this ruler out of the way, and then I can square up the ends and cut the selvage off, okay? Once I've done that, I can put this ruler away. I can get rid of my selvage pieces. That's going to go in the trash. And then I'm going to go back to measuring the way I did before. So on this ruler, which is slightly different than this one, I'm going to find a horizontal line, and I'm going to find the 4.5 inch mark, which is right here in between the 4 and the 5. And again, making sure that horizontal and vertical lines are meeting. I'm at 4.5 inches, so I'm going to open the blade and cut, close the blade, okay? I've cut my first 2 squares of my quilt. Why 2? Because the fabric is folded. And so if I take these apart, that's 2. So, and now we need to sort of start counting. You know, we don't have to count till we get to the end of this, but now I've cut 2 squares, so I'm going to continue the process, cutting all the way to the end of this strip, and then we'll do a little math.
So I'm just going to keep going all the way down the line, very slowly, just making sure that my horizontal line meets and my vertical line meets, and cut all these squares.
Okay, now that I'm done, I have cut 2, 4, 6, 8 squares out of this strip, and I have this little piece right here on the fold. So I need to decide. I know I need 45 squares because that's what the instruction says. I have 8 squares that I've cut, this little piece left over. I have 6 strips total. So that should give me 48 squares, and I only need 45. It's important to know that because let's say I could get 48 squares, but I actually need 52, okay? If I need 52, I can take this little piece left over, unfold it, and instead of getting 8 squares out of this strip, I can get 9 because I can cut what's left of this fold, I can cut into another square. Now, if I had started at the other end, if I had started cutting at the fold, when I got to the end, I would have 2 separated pieces of fabric with a selvage at the end. And I would just have 2 little strips, and I wouldn't be able to get that extra block. So that's why we always start cutting at the selvage so that we have this little folded piece here, because giving that little bit there, if I open it up, I might be able to get an extra couple of strips or an extra couple of squares, or in this case, an extra single square. But since I don't need that, you have a choice. You can either take and cut a square out of this, continue with the math, and cut all the way down till you get to your last strip, and cut less of your last strip, which will leave you a bigger piece of scrap, or you can cut all of the strips to get your 8. You'll have a couple extra squares, and you'll have 6 of these extra little pieces here for your stash. So you can decide from there what you'd like to do. Because she asked us to cut 6 strips, I'm just going to continue cutting my 8 squares from my 6 strips. That'll give me a few extra squares at the end, which in case we mess something up, I'll have a couple of extra squares. And I'll set these pieces aside for another day for scraps, or in case I need something else. So let's continue cutting, or cross-cutting as it were, and get all of our squares cut for this particular fabric.
So I'm just going to keep going right down the line. I'm squaring up the edge, moving my ruler, making sure to close my guard when I set my ruler down. And I'm just going to keep cutting, lining up on the bottom horizontal and also on the vertical to make sure that I'm cutting exactly the right size. Make sure you're paying attention to the numbers and cut all your strips.
I'm also leaving these pieces folded so that they visually look different than the other pieces, so I know that they're scrap, and setting them far away from all my other things. Let's keep cutting.
So I'm going to continue just to cut, moving things out of the way as needed, squaring up my edges, just paying attention, right? It seems like a long job, but it's not super bad. It can be very, oh, there we go. See, I've just made a mistake where I had it lined up at the 5.5 mark and not the 4.5 mark. And that happens so very easily. So I'm used to using Creative Grids rulers, and they have single measurements on one side and half measurements on the other. So I just swapped over to my half measurement side so that I can accurately cut, and I don't have to worry about that mark. But I made the mistake by laying it down on the 5.5 inch mark instead of the 4.5 inch mark. And that can happen so very easily. So just keep it on squaring up the ends, taking off the selvages. Now, if you're an experienced cutter, you've been cutting for a while, you're probably not going to use that side ruler all the time. You may have a different technique, and that's totally okay, but I just want to make sure that I'm teaching beginners, which is what this class is designed for, the proper way to square up your fabric on the end. And that way you can develop really good habits. And then if you want to change those habits after a while, after you get some experience, you can totally do that. But if you take your time and you just pay attention each time you're cutting, don't get discouraged, take breaks if you need to, but just take your time cutting and making sure everything is nice and square on the ends and that it's measured properly, you're going to have so much better results. Your projects are going to be so much better than anyone else's because you took the time to do it the right way.
Okay, we are done cutting fabric A. So I'm going to neaten up this pile and I'm going to go ahead and pin my fabric A marker onto, or my sticky note or my piece of paper, or whatever you have, right on the top couple of squares so that I don't get them confused at all. And then we'll move on to fabric B. All right, gang, here we are again. I am working on my fabric B. My piece of fabric is a little bigger than what we needed. But again, I've put my two edges, I've pressed all the wrinkles out, and I've put my two selvages together and my two edges together. I'm gonna put my little finger in here, and I'm gonna try to get the wrinkle, the big bubble, out of this giant piece of fabric. It's going to be very hard for you to see it on camera, but I'm going to try. And that, I've got the big bubble out, and I feel pretty confident that this fabric is now square. Laying, we're going to square up the edge, but I believe that the fabric is now laid square. So now we're going to square up the edge of the fabric, and we're going to cut the strips for the next part of the quilt. All right, I've laid this down. This one's an interesting one because it looks like it's got a nice straight edge, but it doesn't. Look at that. It's sneaky Pete. It's up underneath here. So I'm going to take a line here on the bottom of this mat and make sure my fold is sitting on a nice straight line. That's always good. And get it all laid out smooth. And then I'm going to go ahead and square up the edge of my fabric.
So I'm going to go ahead and square this one up real quickly, lining up that square on the bottom, making sure I have enough room. I'm not going to use the weight this time because I'm pretty adept at holding the ruler because I've been doing it for so long, but you know, whatever. And then we'll just take that piece off and get started again.
So let's look at the pattern for fabric B, and it says, from fabric B, cut 5 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of the fabric, and I'm going to get 36 squares cross-cutting. That makes sense. So let's lay our long ruler down and cut our 5 4.5-inch strips, and then we'll do the cross-cutting.
So we're just going to speed all of this up because while I need to reinforce for you that you should measure along the bottom of the strip and also the vertical side of the strip, you don't need to sit and watch me cut over and over and over again. Although I'm pretty quick, I can get this cutting done, but it's not a race. Take your time. Now you'll notice here I'm struggling to get it to line up. All of a sudden the vertical line didn't line up. So I'm just going to take the time to re-square up my fabric, and I took a little sliver of it out. I have plenty, so it's no big deal, but I wanted to make sure that my line remained even. So, and that happens. Sometimes we get a little bit out of square, but I did go back and check all the strips to make sure that they were all the right size. And then I folded up the extra fabric, put it away, and now I'm just going to continue to cut and cross cut all of these strips so until I get all of the squares cut that we need for the quilt. And if you just take your time, cutting, I know it's not everybody's favorite part, but if you just take your time and just be careful to line everything up, you should be good to go. And here I am cheating a little bit by cutting it in the opposite direction to get the selvages off, but pretend you didn't see that as a newbie, and we'll just keep going until we're all done.
All right, now I am done with my fabric B, because 8 strips or 8 squares times 5 strips is 40. So I know I have my 36 with extras. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that as my fabric B. Now later on when we get to sewing, you're probably going to see me using slightly different fabric because, as I said before, in my beginner quilt class, I had already cut some fabric and begun to sew it, so I really couldn't show you how to cut that fabric again. But that's okay because we're going to use this quilt for something different, and we'll put this one together as well. So here we are in my organization for this quilt. I have my fabric A squares and my fabric B squares, and they are going to be perfectly ready to put together in our block. And right now, because the next time we meet, we're going to do something a little bit different before we start sewing. So I'm going to go ahead and get a project box to put all this in. So here is the project box that I created for my beginner quilt class. And you can see that I already have things layered out for the cutting for the parts for the one that we're going to be sewing with. And I have these little dividers in here that keep everything nice and neat. So there are my fabric A squares and my fabric B squares for the one that we're already sewing, and everything else in here is already cut. So what I'm going to do is set this lid down on here, and I'm going to start putting in my fabric A squares and my fabric B squares. And you can see how it's real easy to keep everything in this box organized for when I'm ready to pick it up next time. And I know that this is my beginner quilt fabric box, and it's got my project in it. And so until next time, I'm going to take my book and put my book inside of there too. And that way I know where all my parts are, and I can pick this up with the handle and take it to and from class and have everything organized the way it needs to be. So sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself with quilting is to stay this organized, because life just gets in the way. This is a hobby, so it's not like it's our extra job, and I can tell you that this is my job, and I have project boxes stashed all over the studio because I get pulled away. Right now we're working on this project. I'm going to have to take this down to put something else up to work on a different project. It happens all the time. So if you just figure, you know, it's life. I've got other things happening in my house, in the room where my sewing machine is stashed. If you put everything nice and neatly away, or mark it and label it, or keep it organized, and however you want to keep it organized. A lot of times my friends will use clean pizza boxes, you know, that they can get from the local pizza shop. Whatever it is that you need to keep yourself organized, go ahead and feel free to do it. So the next time that we meet, now that we have all of our parts ready and cut for our upcoming sewing day, the next time we meet, we're going to ready our sewing machine. A little bit of a review of what the parts are of your sewing machine, how to go ahead and thread your sewing machine, making sure that you understand how to set your 1/4 inch and how to test that 1/4 inch, and then we're going to start sewing our blocks. So don't get discouraged. I know this is a lot of information and I'm going very, very slowly, but that's okay. We need to go slowly just to learn the steps. So until next time, you keep cutting. Make sure you get all the cutting done for fabric A and fabric B. And I know that it's really tempting to go ahead and cut forth fabric C, D, and E, but resist temptation. There's a reason, okay? There's a reason why I'm not having you do that. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to wait for the next lesson. But in the meantime, you keep cutting. And if you want to see something else that's fun on our channel, you can find us right here on YouTube, or you can find us at cabinquilters.com.